Hello, honeys, and welcome to your second of 3 Fall 2025 monthly holiday specials. This being November, of course, we recognize that it is Native American Heritage Month, and we will celebrate Native American Heritage Day the Friday after Thanksgiving. But our holiday special for this month will be focused on the ubiquitous Turkey Day itself, Thanksgiving. Because it is an image so attached to Thanksgiving in a lot of Americans' minds, we will be looking at Rockwell's Freedom from Want from 1943 today, but we'll make sure and mention his other 3 freedoms as well, which you may not have known about. Rockwell himself is mostly remembered for his 47-year career with the Saturday Post and the success of the more than 320 cover images he designed for them, as well as for his long-standing connection with the Boy Scouts of America, quote, for whom he provided artworks for its annual calendar most of his working years, end quote, according to Art Story. Rockwell came into the spotlight during a period referred to as the Golden Age of Illustration, when the names of illustrators like Winslow Homer, J.C. Leyendecker, Maxfield Parrish, N.C. Wyeth, and Ellen Pyle were household ones. And many of our sources note that even though his, quote, unabashed patriotism and pictorial style made him an easy target for avant-gardists and left-wing intellectuals, his later work revealed the influence of social realism, and several of his mature pieces, especially those he produced for Look magazine, took on a more socio-political edge, end quote. Now, I mentioned Art Story as a source there, and that's just one of many for today's episode. You can check them for yourself in our episode sources document linked in the description. But otherwise, honeys, kick back, relax, because here we go. Now, this being an episode almost exclusively focused on one of his artworks, it only makes sense to overview a little bit Rockwell's life. Norman Rockwell was born February 3rd, 1894 in New York City as the second of 3 in a very religious working-class family. His dad was a Philadelphia textile company manager, and his mom is described as a quote-unquote adventurous homemaker. Rockwell spent his summers as a kid living in New England on country farms, however, which, per his own autobiography, had a pretty big impact on him. Quote, I have no bad memories of my summers in the country, and they had a lot to do with what I painted later on, end quote. It seems that living this sort of dual life, he learned to appreciate the differences in familial bonds as well as the pace of life between city and countryside living. And his family was also pretty artsy, says the National Museum of American Illustrators. His early inspiration to draw and paint came from his father, an avid Sunday painter, and more indirectly from his grandfather's hobbyist canvases of bucolic barnyard scenes. But in spite of the joy he got from those countryside escapes and his close family connections, he struggled with fitting in and meeting the standards of American masculinity during his boyhood. He reportedly felt that all he had was his drawing, but he began to work more and make friends in his teenage years. In fact, he started tutoring several students in algebra, drawing, and painting, including Ethel Barrymore, later regarded as the First Lady of American theater. Ethel's also the great-aunt of the Drew we all know and love. Rockwell then began his art training in 1908 at the Chase School of Fine and Applied Art Making, taking classes there in addition to his regular high school studies, but he eventually did drop out of high school in 1910 to study art full-time at the National Academy School. Later that same year, he transferred to the Art Students League of New York. A couple of our sources suggest that he did so specifically to study with Thomas Fogarty, who's a specialist in illustration who also prepared him for early commercial commissions, as well as George Bridgman, a life study technical skills guru. The Rockwell family also moved to New Rochelle, New York during this time, and that's where he really got involved in the arts and gained confidence in himself as a person, according to the Saturday Evening Post itself. Further schooling and connections in the arts world that he made there eventually led to his launchpad. For example, his first major commission came in 1912 at the age of 18 in the form of his first book illustration for Carl H. Claudy's Tell Me Why, Stories About Mother Nature. Fogarty then recommended that same year that Rockwell show his work to Edward Cave, who'd recently been appointed to fully develop Boy's Life magazine, which was published by the Boy Scouts of America, into a national publication. Cave, in turn, gave Rockwell 2 preliminary assignments to test his skills, a camping guide for the Boy Scouts, and also to keep up his contributions for Boy's Life until he'd created 400 illustrations. Rockwell was so successful at both that the next year, at only age 19, Rockwell became the art editor for Boy's Life. In the year 1914, Rockwell also became friends with Clyde Victor Forsyth, an older fellow boarder, cartoonist, and Boy's Life contributor, who urged his new friend to submit his work to the Saturday Evening Post. Rockwell, of course, had some early success there with 6 of his paintings used as weekly covers between the end of May 1916 and January 1917. 1917, thus beginning the working relationship of a lifetime. But Rockwell was not only working, he was also a young man with a wide-open future ahead of him. And in 1916, he meets Irene O'Connor, a school teacher 3 years older than him, and falls head over heels. She accepts his impulsive proposal, but it soon became clear the marriage would not be easy since Irene expected him to have a regular work schedule and wanted him to attend social events with her. Still, Rockwell's star kept rising throughout his 20s and 30s. He had worked on illustrated advertisements for many businesses, including Jell-O and Orange Crush, by the early 1920s. And the artist became most associated with the American Realism movement as he continued these commercial productions. That's partially because he generally formed his scenes with humor and respect for the subjects, end quote, with an attention to detail that, in his words, would make the spectator, inner quote, want to sigh and smile at the same time, end all quotes. He remained stalwart in painting positive and unambiguous images at a time when abstract art was coming to dominate the Western art scene, and believed that his images, quote, trumped the self-indulgences of abstract experimentation, end quote. Years later, Abigail Rockwell wrote, quote, "Some say life will never be as perfect as life in a Norman Rockwell painting, but my grandfather's work isn't about an unachievable ideal. Pop's work is about believing in the goodness of people. It's about finding that goodness in ourselves and others and in the moments we spend with one another," end quote. Interestingly enough, our sources report that he was worried he didn't, quote, feel enough passion about great works of art, end quote. But that may be because of how he saw the work of an illustrator. The National Museum of American Illustrators quotes him saying that no man with a conscience can just bat out illustrations. He's got to put all of his talent, all of his feeling into them. If illustration is not considered art, then that is something that we have brought upon ourselves by not considering ourselves artists. I believe that we should say, quote, "I am not just an illustrator, I am an artist," end all quotes. Rockwell did break a little bit from the norms of his day to use photography to capture an image of his sitters, who were almost always friends or friends as friends, as well as using a projector to trace and sketch photos onto canvas. Even in spite of the protests and horror of the purists who believed that art should always be produced, quote-unquote, freehand. The theme of escape also became a prominent feature of his work during the 1920s and 30s after a 1922 trip to study abroad in southern France, Italy, and Switzerland. But for several reasons, including the aforementioned ones, Irene and Norman's marriage was rocky until they eventually split. They spent multiple periods apart, separating and reuniting between 1916 and fall of 1929, at which point she fell in love with a quote-unquote more masculine man, apparently in her own words, and announced that she wanted a divorce. We can only imagine the insecurities that brought up for Rockwell. To be fair, points out Art's story, he was a serial philanderer himself. All the same, Rockwell was deeply depressed by this and traveled to California to be supported by his good buddy Forsyth. Apparently, this grief does not last too long, however, because once Rockwell gets there, he meets middle school math teacher Mary Barstow, who is 14 years younger than him, and they marry in April of 1930. The couple has 3 boys within the decade and moves to Arlington, Virginia in 1939. And by all accounts, this marriage was not perfect either. By the fall of 1948, Mary had sought psychiatric treatment for anxiety and drinking problems, while, quote, Norman had also consented to therapy for his own anxiety and frequent bouts with depression. And in December of 1953, the Rockwells made the joint decision to move to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, to be nearer to their treatment center and to generally enjoy the social and cultural benefits of an urban setting. Norman had a new studio, and he and Mary began attending live model sketching classes together, end quote. He continued work throughout certain periods during those decades, the late 30s, 40s, and then into the 50s. But in 1955, he again begins consistent work for the Saturday Evening Post, mostly painting portraits of presidential candidates. But on August 25th of 1959, Mary unexpectedly and sadly passes away at the age of 51 from heart failure. Rockwell is so very badly shaken by this, he becomes unfocused, disturbed, and depressed in spite of the support from his family and friends. But Rockwell is not one to be kept down for long. He meets Molly Punderson, a 62-year-old teacher who led an adult poetry class that he had taken at a local library, and they marry in October of 1961. The couple spends the next few years, 63 through 64 especially, traveling. They flew to Russia, for example, for a world fair, and then on to Egypt, where Rockwell painted the portrait of President Nasser. The Saturday Evening Post confirms that the last cover he did for them in 1963 was a portrait of John F. Kennedy a week after the president's assassination. By By this point, however, Rockwell needed to find new sources for commissions because the Post was in financial decline. Rockwell had several offers on the table, including from Look and McCall's magazines, which were very interested in his work, but Rockwell went with Look, feeling that that would be the most interesting one. It included foreign coverage and series about religion and news of Southern racial tensions. He was now 69 himself and looking to tackle these heavier topics in his work. The publication of the first major biography of the artist, as well as his first solo exhibition, came in 1968, the latter of which was held at the Bernard Dannenberg Gallery. Interest in Rockwell's work spiked during the 1970s as well, probably as a reflection of the general rejection of abstract art at that moment in time, say our sources. Rockwell passed away on November 8th of 1978 in Massachusetts. As I mentioned, our main work for today is one in a series of four titled The Four Freedoms, and that series itself was inspired by President Franklin Roosevelt's January 6, 1941, Four Freedoms State of the Union address to Congress. In it, FDR identified four essential human rights that he thought were in need of universal protection given the events of the day. These were freedom from want, freedom from fear, freedom of speech, and freedom of worship. One of FDR's big takeaways from World War I was to not underestimate the importance and power of public opinion and support, so he set out to unite Americans on a, quote, concept or idea worth the ultimate sacrifice, end quote, as Collector put it, in an effort to overcome the isolationist mindset of the American public. And reports from overseas about the heinous acts being perpetrated by the Germans and Japanese gave the United States government a perfect opportunity to quote-unquote sell its people on the idea of a quote-unquote good war, quote, where the contrast between the noble and evil was no less than that between light and darkness in the famed paintings of Italian Baroque artist Caravaggio. Following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, it was time to start the advertising campaign for war. This time around, it would not be to make the world safe for democracy, the American people would fight for freedom, end quote. And that one came from Art Story. I liked the Caravaggio comparison there. Independent pro-war committees like the Committee to Defend America, Fight for Freedom Committee, and Freedom House used the moniker freedom as early as 1940, but FDR cemented the justification of quote-unquote defending freedom as the basis of U.S. intervention into arguably the most significant conflict the world had ever seen, telling his fellow Americans, quote, we know that enduring peace cannot be bought at the cost of other people's freedom, end quote. And his administration decided to utilize the rising mediums of national newspapers, magazines, and radio to garner support for the idea because, as our sources put it, famous American historian Eric Poner once pointed out in his book The Story of American Freedom, quote, to sell goods we must sell words, end quote, and that had become a motto of advertisers. In this case, goods was actually the intangible concept of universal freedoms. The problem was, the Rockwell Museum explains, that government surveys put out not long after showed that, quote, only half of Americans were aware of his four freedoms after his speech, and that less than a quarter could identify them correctly. Moreover, many had no clear idea why the United States was being called upon to enter the war, end quote. So Roosevelt's administration realized that continuous efforts by the White House, the Office of War Information, established by executive order in June of 1942, and, quote, scores of patriotic artists, end quote, were needed to give the Four Freedoms a new urgency and gravity in the American public consciousness. They got to work on recruiting. And a side note of enormous consequence, the Four Freedoms concept was also adapted into the basis of the Atlantic Charter issued in August of 1941 by the USA and Great Britain. The charter, to refresh everyone's memory, was basically an outline of their vision for the post-World War II world and stated their common war aims. Yet according to the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, Rockwell's paintings were almost never made. He once stated himself, according to the Collector, quote, I wanted to do something bigger than a war poster, to make some statement about what the country was fighting for, end quote, and first pitched his Four Freedoms idea to the graphic division of the War Department's Office of Facts and Figures in May of 1942. That office was unable to commit financially, and even though Rockwell was not new to war propaganda, having painted popular images for the post of American soldiers and Boy Scouts during the First World War, the The Office of War Information's initial focus was on films, photographs, and radio broadcasts, as well as poster campaigns like J. Howard Miller's iconic "We Can Do It, Rosie the Riveter" image. Rockwell was reportedly told by that office, quote, "The last war you illustrators did the posters. This war we're going to use fine arts men, real artists," end quote. Rockwell headed home to Vermont feeling utterly defeated, but first stopped in Philadelphia to meet Ben Hibbs, his new editor at the Saturday Evening Post. Hibbs, however, enthusiastically embraced Rockwell's Four Freedoms concept and told him to drop everything else to make the series. 7 months later, they were complete. 7 months was almost 3 times as long as it was expected to take him to finish them, but he told his impatient editors, quote, "I just cannot express to you how much this series means to me. Aside from their wonderful patriotic motive, there are no subjects which could rival them in opportunity for human interest," end quote, writes the Smithsonian Magazine. Rockwell's final paintings measured at 44 by 48 inches each, but were published as a full-page interior illustration in 1943 in the Post, each one accompanied by an essay on the topic at hand, commissioned from writers including Booth Tarkington, Will Durant, Carlos Bulasson, and Stephen Vincent Benet. And as we'll see, the biggest difference between FDR's meaning and Rockwell's visualization is the president's intended international scale versus the artist's national application. And before we get to the star of our show, an overview of the other freedoms. First, freedom of speech. In this piece, a man in a brown jacket and blue plaid shirt stands up in the middle of a seated crowd of mostly middle-aged or older white men to speak while the others look towards him or around the room. They are all clearly holding a turquoise pamphlet titled Annual Report of, and then some town in Vermont's name, and seem to be discussing whatever's inside it. Rockwell wrote years later in his autobiography, My Adventures as an Illustrator from 1988, that the image was inspired by the memory of witnessing Jim Edgerton, a Vermont farmer, standing up in a small town hall meeting to protest a tax hike for a new school, and who was allowed to speak despite everyone clearly disagreeing with him. Quote, "No one had shouted him down. My gosh, I thought that's it. There it is. Freedom of speech," end quote. And our sources say it took him 4 tries before Rockwell felt that he had gotten this one quite right. Freedom of worship uses a much more grayish scale. Here we see a mix of genders and ages, though it is still mostly all white people shown. One woman holds a rosary while another folds his hands in prayer, and a man in a fez holds a Bible or maybe Quran. The text in skinny caps across the top reads, quote, "Each according to the dictates of his own conscience," end quote. That line is a fascinating choice because it's so off the beaten path, especially for the time. It's a quote from the founder of the LDS Church, Joseph Smith. This image also reportedly took almost 2 months by itself due to the care that Rockwell showed towards this very delicate subject. He wanted to make sure he was not disparaging anyone's beliefs in this image. Freedom from Fear shows a young mother in a fluffy skirt tucking the couple's 2 young boys into bed while the noticeably slightly older father stands next to her holding a newspaper with pieces of the title visible, reading, quote, "Bombings kill" and, quote, "horror hit." Toys and dolls are scattered on the floor along with other decorative details of the home that are made visible. It's a little harder to see the connection between this image's construction and Freedom from Fear, but it's based on the idea that Americans did not need to worry the same way as Londoners did when putting their children to sleep during the time of the German Blitz on the UK. Our sources argue that the meaning was largely missed by those outside the USA, with the exception, of course, of those in the UK. But we want to circle back to that visible headline because it's a very crucial choice. It's the only overt reference to the war or current events at all in the entire series. Rockwell also later admitted that this was among his least favorite of the images, as was Freedom from Want, published on March 6, 1943. The Milan Art Institute writes that the third painting in the series, considered to be one of his best works ever, was inspired by and has of course become a model for the All-American Thanksgiving. The painting itself sold for $46 million in a bidding war, an American record and twice the estimated value of it, in December of 2013, though I was not able to find out who to. In any case, the painting has made its way to the Rockwell Museum since. All of the characters in this artwork were family members or friends. For example, his mother Nancy and second wife Mary, whom Rockwell photographed separately, then painted together as a group gathered in his home in Virginia. The image, quote, symbolized Rockwell's hopes for a post-war period, and as such it presented an idealized vision of America as a rural and agricultural haven. Art critic and biographer Deborah Solomon described this composition as offering, inner quote, a new level of descriptive realism, yet the painting doesn't feel congested or fussy. It is open and airy in the center, end all quotes. It of course features a complete Thanksgiving feast of delicately detailed and modeled dishes with glasses and serving items framed by the many individual faces. As viewers, we are even still invited to the table as guests by our view into the picture from our seat at the head of the table, as well as the turning of a couple of people's faces towards us. And those exact details are what give away the fact that this image might be about a lack of want, but that its heart lies in the emphasis on human connection. Writes the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, quote, "Despite this appetizing spread, the people seated at the table do not gaze hungrily at the fare before them. Instead, they appear to marvel at one another, rejoicing in the love and togetherness that fill the room," end quote. For that reason, this image is timeless and able to speak to many kinds of want by many segments of the population both then and now. We find it notable that celebrated authors wrote the other three accompaniment articles, but that Freedom from Want's accompaniment was written by relatively unknown Filipino poet Carlos Bulosan, who immigrated to the United States at the age of 16. Our sources argue that his essay added even more depth to Rockwell's message. Freedom from Want also, of course, speaks to Rockwell's technical skill. He claimed that it was the easiest of the four freedoms to complete, but it has long been celebrated for its technical mastery of white-on-white painting. By that, I mean that we can clearly distinguish the texture and shape of the white plates on top of the white tablecloth. And regarding the polished-looking white middle-class nuclear family we have here, we do, of course, notice the lack of diversity in the artwork these days, but that doesn't mean it's any less meaningful, especially as Freedom from Want may have stood the test of time since, on a deeper level, it really does exemplify the concept of chosen family, where family is not validated through biological connection, but can include friends and neighbors who choose to play significant roles in each other's lives, as did happen here with Rockwell's creation of the image. By using his own chosen family as models for the work, Rockwell, quote, explores the question of whom we welcome at our table and into our lives, messages that anticipate his later works, such as Golden Rule in 1961, which take pro-civil rights stances, end quote. And again, as we'll circle back to, because of his frequently mild subject matters, people commonly assume that Rockwell was politically conservative, but in reality, he held many progressive views. He was just beholden to the regulations of his employers, like the Saturday Evening Post. We also find a good comparison point in Rockwell's later image from 1951 titled Saying Grace, which features a middle-aged woman and a young boy seated at a crowded table in a noisy diner, praying before eating as the other two young men sat at their table stare at them and other diners turn to observe them as well. But that's all that happens here, so Rockwell's message is pretty evident. We can all live in peace and share the world if we show respect for each other's beliefs. Saying Grace, of course, comes from a slightly different context in 1951 there. This one was more meant to comfort Americans in the post-war readjustment period by demonstrating how ordinary Americans can find faith in kindness and the strength to trust in others. Hence the text on the image reading, quote, "Our world is not the happy place these days," end quote. Like Freedom from Want, this too was staged in real life, this time at a cafe near Times Square in Manhattan after Rockwell brought furniture into the studio and took reference pictures. Which brings us, of course, to Reception and Legacy. We'll start with that of the series. Rockwell's paintings so clearly conveyed the importance of each freedom through such realistic and heartfelt portrayals of everyday American life that they transcended even their wartime purpose, becoming iconic symbols of Americana. The Post itself received a flood of requests for reprints, including from the U.S. government, resulting in the distribution of millions of copies of them via the Treasury Department's war bond drives. The paintings also began showing up as posters in railroad stations, post offices, schools, and other public or semi-public buildings. Writes the Smithsonian Magazine, the posters raised over $132,992,539. And I don't even know if that's converted into today's money. None of our sources would confirm that or not. But that's part of the reason it was important that the Freedom series featured public, regular Americans, not soldiers or politicians who were less relatable. Instead, the common figures within them formed an example as well as a rallying call which the public felt connected to. Reception of Rockwell's freedoms was mixed outside of the U.S., however, especially due to their focus on American culture. For example, non-Americans suffering from the effects of wartime food shortages did not love freedom from want, which seemed to imply a narrative of plenitude, while freedom from fear, quote, irritated some people in Allied war zones who were unable to protect their children from an immediate threat, end quote, according to our sources. As for the long-term legacy of the Freedom series, even after the war, they continued to be used as traveling propaganda, making another national expedition aboard the Freedom Train in 1947 through 48 to be viewed by over 3.5 million Americans in 326 cities. The set of four then lived in the offices of the Saturday Evening Post throughout the 1950s and most of the 60s, with Rockwell finally reclaiming them before the magazine closed its doors in 1969. Freedom from Want itself is by far one of Norman Rockwell's most appropriated works of art, for example, by both the creators of The Simpsons as well as of the Joker and Harley Quinn from the Batman universe. 2018 saw a photographic reimagining of the series, and the artwork has been referenced in all kinds of sitcoms, including an episode of Modern Family. The Rockwell Museum cites a few other further impacts, namely that Roosevelt's words and Rockwell's artworks became inseparable in the public consciousness of the day. The Four Freedoms, especially once visualized, grew into an almost universally recognized concept across our nation, as well as an international foundation for human rights. Quote, when Eleanor Roosevelt convinced the United Nations delegates to include these ideals in its post-war statement of human rights, FDR's words, now forever entwined with Rockwell's images, achieved immortality, end quote. As for the legacy of Rockwell himself, his good friend Clyde Forsyth once commented, quote, there has never been a period of brilliance in the course of Norman Rockwell's advance. The answer is work, after work, more work, after work in the studio, work at home, reading worthwhile literature on art and life, thinking out ideas, studying, work. Rockwell's hobbies are work and work, end quote. Even in 1931, according to our sources, the Standard Star published an interview with Rockwell in which it described him, quote, as an anomaly in art history, inner quote, there probably has never been in the world's history before an artist with a regular audience of at least 6 million people. So may we please introduce to you Mr. Norman Rockwell, whose covers for the Saturday Evening Post are known, we venture to say, to every inhabitant of the United States, end quote. Rockwell additionally received the USA's highest civilian honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which was presented to him by President Gerald R. Ford in 1977 for Rockwell's, quote, vivid and affectionate portraits of our country, end quote, and for portraying, quote, the American scene with unrivaled freshness and clarity, end quote. The Guardian even reported in April of 1972, not long after its publication, that, quote, the book Norman Rockwell, Artist and Illustrator was sold out in the first 2 months, grossing $2.5 million US dollars at the initial offering price of $45. At $60 a copy, sales have reached almost $10 million US dollars, more than the hardcover and paperback gross of Love Story, end quote. I don't know what Love Story is, but I assume a popular novel at that time. And along with all that, as we've mentioned a few times now, Rockwell got more politically concerned as time went on, which brings us back to the problem we all live with, as well as the recap of a business connection. USA Today published an op-ed article by the Rockwell family on November 2nd this year titled, quote, we're Norman Rockwell's family. Trump's DHS has shamefully misused his work, end quote. The Department of Homeland Security has been sharing reproductions of Rockwell's paintings on its X, Instagram, and Facebook accounts with captions that promote anti-immigrant rhetoric since this summer, and the Rockwells have apparently finally had enough. The family points out that, quote, his efforts to eradicate prejudices both within himself and others led him to explore issues of racism, violence, and segregation well into his 70s. Golden Rule, 1961, Murder in Mississippi, 1965, and New Kids in the Neighborhood, Negro in the Suburbs of 1967 all demonstrate his deep commitment to equality and anti-racism, end quote. And the most famous of those works not in that list is The Problem We All Live With, which captures Ruby Bridges, the first African-American child to attend a newly desegregated public school after a federal court ordered the New Orleans school system to integrate on her first day at William William Franz Elementary on November 14, 1960, accompanied by faceless federal officers, even though we see the remains of thrown tomatoes as well as the N-word scrawled on the wall behind her. Our sources remind us that, quote, public outcry was so great that white parents withdrew their children from school so they would not have to sit with a black girl. Ruby spent an entire year in a classroom by herself, end quote. A little refresher of our history here, Bridges' parents had responded to a call from the local NAACP chapter's leaders to challenge school segregation in New Orleans a decade after Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 in order to make this happen, but ultimately suffered for that decision. Quote, her father lost his job and her grandparents, who were sharecroppers in Mississippi, were forced off their land, end quote. The Problem We All Live With was produced at the height of the civil rights movement and is now considered a symbol of that struggle. One of our sources explains that Miss Bridges Hall never met Rockwell, but as an adult came to admire his decision to tell her story. Quote, here was a man that had been doing lots of work, painting family images, and all of a sudden decided, this is what I'm going to do. It's wrong, and I'm going to say that it's wrong. The mere fact that Norman Rockwell had enough courage to step up to the plate and say, I'm going to make a statement, and he did it in a very powerful way. Even though I had not had an opportunity to meet him, I commend him for that, end quote. Ruby Bridges Hall, founder of the Ruby Bridges Foundation, which promotes, quote, the values, tolerance, respect, and appreciation of all differences, end quote, was honored at the White House by then President Obama on the 50th anniversary of her integration. And he reportedly told her, quote, if it hadn't been for you, I might not be here, end quote. Rockwell's family went on to write in that op-ed that they, quote, as his eldest son, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, believe that now is the time to follow in his footsteps and stand for the values he truly wished to share with us and all Americans, compassion, inclusiveness, and justice for all, end quote. The authorship of that article is credited to 10 Rockwells. The fact that so many in the family feel this way is in itself notable. And of course, he has a museum. The Rockwell Museum was established originally in Philadelphia in 1976, then moved to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, and reopened in 1993. It now holds the world's largest collection of original Rockwell art. The museum also has pointed out connections in the image formation between him and filmmakers George Lucas as well as Steven Spielberg, mainly that all three, quote, evoke love of country, small-town values, children growing up, unlikely heroes, acts of imagination, and life's ironies, end quote, via a 2011 exhibition. And so, in conclusion, and in the words of PBS, Rockwell, quote, harbored deep insecurities about his work. What is unmistakable, however, is that Rockwell tapped into the nostalgia of a people for a time that was remembered as kinder and simpler, end quote, as his prolific career spanned the days of horse-drawn carriages to mankind's first landing on the moon. Rockwell chose to fill his canvases with the nuances of ordinary people in everyday life, even as history was in the making all around him. And that is our special for Thanksgiving for the month of November in the year 2025. I hope you honeys have enjoyed. I am going to get some rest. We've had a lot of NHD visits. I've been helping students with their research and doing my own, and my brain is tired. Until next time, honeys, be sure to keep your eyes out for new Substack articles as well as a 5-minute musical drop before the end of the month. Hydrate or dihydrate, and take care. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugnout. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.